Greetings, nerds. This is SNN Nerd. I'm your host, Sarah Belmont, and with me, as always, is our Mr. Producer, Will Polk. How are you doing tonight, Will?
Doing very well, Sarah. It's good to be with you on a Sunday afternoon again.
Yeah.
Usually I know we've gotten to this Monday evening routine, but it's weird recording when when the sun is out.
What are you, vampire or something?
Exactly, I am.
You can only podcast in the evening.
Exactly, because I'm a vampire, and we have a guest who can get into vampires and how biologically accurate they are today.
I didn't think that's why we had him join today. I thought it was mainly because you needed somebody to talk about Trek, a full Trekkie.
That's the real reason. But I was just trying to soften it for you.
All right. Do you want to do the introduction?
Yeah, I will. Thank you for letting me introduce our guest today. It's Dr. Mohamed Noor from Duke University. He is known on the YouTubeverse as Bio-Trekkie and is a science consultant to the Star Trek universe. In his day job, he is the Dean of Natural Sciences at Duke University. In their biology department, he graduated from College of William and Mary and has a PhD from the University of Chicago. He joined the Duke Biology Department in 2005 and published many books, one of which we'll talk about today. And he's an award-winning scientist. And just if you haven't been to his YouTube channels or seen him at Comic-Con or Dragon Con or some of the other events, go to YouTube and look up Dr. Noor or Bio-Trekkie. It is well worth a watch. And with that, welcome to our show, Dr. Noor.
Thank you very much. That's a very generous introduction. I really appreciate that.
He wants brownie points right away.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for us. We do, before we get into all of the Star Trek talk and everything else, we do have should probably spend a few minutes talking about the recent passing of Chadwick Boseman, Black Panther, among many other pivotal roles over the past few years. It broke out on Friday night that he died of colon cancer, to everyone's shocking response, and it was just damn. So yeah. Will, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge blow to everyone. I mean, to think he had been dealing with this for 4 years and just was a consummate professional, cranking out. I watched Black Panther last night, part of the rewatch on Twitter and party, and as I was sitting there watching those scenes and just seeing, realizing that what he was going through when he was filming that film, all the other MCU films he was in, with Infinity War and Endgame, and then of course the roles he's played Jackie Robinson and Thurgood Marshall. I mean, he's just an amazing individual, and it's definitely was a huge blow not only to the fandom but also just to society to lose someone special as Chadwick Boseman.
Yeah, as special, and just someone who came out of nowhere to get all of these roles, and then all of a sudden now his career is done and he passed away, and you're just like, whoa.
Yeah.
We expect we were gonna see him for decades, but now we're not, and it's definitely a life cut short for sure. All right, so Star Trek. There's no good transition, and I blame Will on this because he always wants to start with random topic and make me figure this out. But all right, Dr. Noor, let's get into this. So you went on a Star Trek cruise recently?
I did. It was phenomenal. Actually, the timing was really good in that I went the very first week of March. So it was a scary time to actually be getting on a cruise ship because it was right as cruises were starting to be shutting down or experiencing problems. So it was a little nerve-wracking. I will say, on the safety front, they were taking it very, very seriously. There was hand sanitizer coming down like rain everywhere, it seemed like.
Wow.
I mean, and people were being, people were told to, distance as well as they can. I mean, obviously, it was a cruise, so people weren't taking it so well just because this was the very start of the pandemic, but there was a high awareness for it. And as far as I know, nobody from our cruise actually got sick. I think one person who was on the cruise actually got COVID, but they didn't get it on the cruise. They got it afterwards because this was a medical professional. But yeah, as an experience of setting aside the whole COVID aspect, it was phenomenal. I really, really enjoyed it so much.
Yeah. So, was everyone in cosplay the whole time?
I mean, people flip back and forth. I mean, sometimes people were in cosplay, sometimes people were just wearing like a Star Trek T-shirt, and sometimes they were just wearing normal clothes. It was a mixture throughout. But what was great is the boat had a whole lot of Star Trek themed aspects to it. So they had like Quark's bar and things like that on the boat.
Nice.
But even beyond that, just we all had this like common love for something, and we were in this enclosed area. So basically, if you're in line for anything, you could talk to people, and you already knew a conversation topic that's readily available to anybody. So that was great. Everybody was very, very positive and excited and looking forward to things. And we stopped at a couple of great destinations. We went to San Juan, Puerto Rico. We went someplace in the Dominican Republic. We went to the Bahamas. And we had some great outings there, and sometimes with the actors and other folks associated with Star Trek, sometimes not. But it was just so much fun.
Cool. So were you treated like a member of the cast? I mean, given that you are a science consultant to the show, that people know who you were or recognize you from various Comic-Cons or your YouTube videos?
That's a great question. So I hadn't actually started the YouTube channel yet, so this was before that. But the timing on the announcement, so I actually started consulting last year, but it didn't go public until literally the day before we flew down to go on the cruise. It was like nick of time that went public. So, I mean, I don't think anybody knew me from that, though clearly people had heard that news, that people had heard the announcement that had come out from on Twitter and things like that around that. What I was doing is I was giving talks on the ship. And some people had seen me at previous conventions and knew that, but other people knew me because I was just on the guest list. Like if you went to the cruise website and scrolled down past the actors, you then got to me and some of the other folks who were on there, like artists and story writers and makeup folks, and also Dr. Erin McDonald, who's also she's the main science consultant for the Star Trek universe. She was also giving talks, and I gave one with her as well. But yeah, people definitely knew me. It was a little shocking. Like I actually did an experiment in the last couple of days as I was walking down the halls. I just say hi to everybody, and I think something like 75% of the time, the response would be, "Hi, doctor." Like, whoa. So they may not remember my name, but they knew exactly who I was. Like, wow, okay. And you figure the other 25%, some of them may have known. They may have just said hi back,
Right. Just give you a live long and prosper signs as you're walking down the...
Right. Yeah, we were told to do that rather than shaking hands just because of the virus.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Oh.
Wow.
That makes sense.
It does.
Like that. So in terms of giving talks, and you've been a speaker at Comic-Con, what is the preparation like for one of those talks, and also just the experience in general, as opposed to being there just as a fan, but now you're also a speaker at an event like that?
Sure. So the first time I went to any sort of convention was actually just in 2014. This was just going as an attendee. I didn't even have these things on my radar before that. I mean, I knew they existed, but I didn't really know anything about them. But in 2014, my daughter asked me if I wanted to go to Dragon Con. That was definitely like starting at the deep end of the pool. Yeah. So we went. We drove down to Atlanta from North Carolina. It was quite a drive, and we spent 2 days. We didn't stay for the whole thing, but we stayed for like the 2 full weekend days there. And it was so much fun, like just the energy, the excitement, the amazing cosplays. And that's where I learned that there were actually science talks at these things. I had no idea at the time that people gave science talks at comic conventions or around science fiction or anything like that. I mean, I did know that there were talks about science and science fiction just more generally, but I didn't necessarily know that they happened in that sort of outlet. Actually, one of my colleagues who's at Duke University, his name is Professor Eric Spana. He actually has given talks at DragonCon starting, I think that may have been his first year doing that, was that year in 2014. So I actually attended his talk on the science in the video game Mass Effect. He also has a very popular one on science in Harry Potter and things like that. So he's fantastic, by the way. But I saw those and I was like, wow, this is really cool. And they have at DragonCon, they have tracks. So they have like a puppetry track, they have an American sci-fi media track, and they have a Trek track. So I went to a lot of Trek track things there. And there were some academic talks. I wouldn't say necessarily science talks. There's some academic talks around it, but I proposed then to the Trek track director after seeing this. So the Trek track director is actor Garrett Wang, who is an actor in Star Trek Voyager. As you know, he played Harry Kim.
Mm-hmm.
I proposed to him and said, well, is this something you would be amenable to me doing? I mean, I could create something about depictions of evolution in Star Trek and talk about things like the famous episode from Next Generation, The Chase, and why that particular depiction doesn't actually work so well, but there are other depictions that could. And he said, yeah, we'd love that. We love having more science content. So 2016, I did that for the first time, and I had no idea what to expect. No idea whatsoever. I mean, I'd seen these things, but I didn't know, somebody coming in new as opposed to somebody who'd been doing this for a while. But that very first time, I mean, they put me in a fairly big room, and there must have been about 150, 200 people in there coming to see the talk. And they were so into it. I mean, just that level of excitement for hearing just, evidence for evolution and basic evolutionary principles and some applications to it to Star Trek was phenomenal. I mean, I was so jazzed by it. So I said, that's it, I'm in. And they do a lot of the talks at these conventions are just sort of open Q&As.
Right.
Those are fun too, but it's a different sort of beast because there it's just, it's I actually have the problem that my breadth of knowledge across sci-fi is not great. I mean, I know Star Trek very well. I know a couple of other science fiction franchises like Battlestar Galactica, some of those very well too. But they asked me like in, The Expanse, which at that point in time I'd never actually seen it all. When blah, blah, blah happens, could that happen? Like, I don't know. I have no idea what.
Let me watch the show first.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a hard show to get into. I've tried.
What I've tried to do is I've tried to push it more in the direction of presentations, and therefore then the questions are more focused on the things I know as opposed to just this general ask me anything kind of format. So those I find a little bit hard, but I think some people who have a much broader view of sci-fi are better at those than I am.
So then I have to ask, what is the difference between Star Trek science and Harry Potter science? One dark and one light?
Yeah, there's a little bit of that. I mean, one is definitely more fantasy and one is definitely more science fiction. So, I mean, in Harry Potter, obviously, like they very much call everything magic. So at that point, once you say the word magic, you've essentially already abandoned science. Once you say that word.
Dark arts.
So I mean, the way my colleague Eric Spana talks about it, he doesn't talk about it as scientific explanations for the magic. He more talks about things like let's talk about the inheritance of hair color, or the inheritance of being or having magical abilities in Harry Potter. That's the way he looks at it. So he's not trying to explain what's depicted there, but he's just using it as a conduit. And I think this came out from, and he's told the story many times, I think this came out from once when he was giving a class and he was trying to explain something to the class and they were kind of not particularly paying attention. But once he then contextualized in the context of Harry Potter, all of a sudden they were way more interested. Like, oh, I see, oh, squib, that's a reversion back to losing the ability, things like that. So.
Is that similar to the idea behind your book, Live Long and Evolve, What Star Trek Can Teach Us About Evolution, Genetics, and Life on Other Worlds?
Yes. So what happened with the book is basically the same overall coverage that I teach in my introductory genetics and evolution class at Duke University. It's essentially the same breadth of topics covered, admittedly not to the same depth, of course, but it's the same breadth of topics and covered just a little bit lighter. And the idea there was to exactly like you said, frame it in the context of different scenes from various episodes, so I can engage the reader the same, better than if I just tried to present the biological concept straight away. So this came out, as an outcome from giving these convention talks. And actually, the press approached me and asked me if I wanted to write a public book. And I said at the time, most of the public talks I was giving was just on evidence for evolution, but there's already a really good book out there called Why Evolution is True. There's no need for me to write a better one because, I mean, I would be hard pressed to do it. It's really, really good. So she asked me, like, would you give any other public talks? I said, well, there is something. It's kind of out there, literally out there.
Yeah. The last frontier, but.
Yeah. So I had a demo version of the first talk I was giving at DragonCon that I put on YouTube just because I wanted to get some feedback before I actually did it in a room with live people. And that actually was extraordinarily helpful. Some people actually pointed out to me, I wouldn't say errors, but other aspects which I didn't cover. And I was like, oh, that is good. So that helped me a lot. So I pointed her to that same video and she said, I like this. I think we could do this. So that's where that came from.
No, I think that's awesome. I know that if I had a book that would take Harry Potter and explain science to me, I would definitely have done better in those courses in school.
Same here.
But
Yeah.
just I think that's why I like film and TV in general, is because often I watch movies or I watch TV shows, and for whatever reason, in context of those stories, I am able to apply them in everyday life and learn and and I just think it's good. Battlestar Galactica will teach you a lot about politics, in my opinion.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Some great speeches in there on the political front. But you're exactly right. The key word that you just used is dead on. It's a story. People love stories. You know, you can sit there and describe the Krebs cycle or whatever random biological principle. Nobody really cares. Whereas if you give them a story around it, here's these things to be thinking about in the story that you're already engaged in, they're going to retain it much, much better. They're going to be more interested to learn it. And just overall, it's a better experience for both the teachers and the learners.
Right. Exactly. Will, are you still on this call?
I'm still here. It was just, I was, for someone who is not a big Star Trek fan, I was just letting you go because I was letting you go, Sarah. You were doing great, but I did have a Trek as far as the book though. So how long has the book been out?
The book came out, the hardcover version came out in September 2018, and then the paperback just earlier this year.
Okay. Are you planning on doing a sequel?
Well, let me tell you what the book entailed first, and that'll answer the question. So, like I said, the coverage from the book is the same as my introductory genetics and evolution class. So the science part I had mostly down. The one exception being the very first chapter of the book, which was more exobiology, and that's something I didn't really know anything about at all. So I had to basically learn that as I was writing that. But the rest of it, it covered things I know very well, both from my research and from my teaching. The Star Trek part, again, I had seen it, but I hadn't gone through it trying to pull out all these examples. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to have a book like this that's aimed at people who potentially really know and really like Star Trek and miss stuff. So what I had to do is I had to start at the, basically going through all the episodes of all the series. So this was original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and even the start of Discovery was in there as well. I had to go through all those and rewatch all those things and try to identify what are pieces that are relevant to the various chapters that are going to be in my book. So I had this massive spreadsheet, an Excel file, where all the rows were the different episodes and the columns were the chapters. And I would just enter as I was watching each episode something that was relevant to genetics, or something that's relevant to species formation, or something that's relevant to the evolution of sex, all those things in those columns. So that took about a year.
Wow.
So I didn't watch every single one. What I did for some of them, I just go through the script, because I could go through the script in about a third of the time that I had watched the episode. Yeah. But I had to go through them because the problem is they don't always use the right term. So I couldn't just do a word search or something like that, because sometimes something's depicted, but they say this other thing. Like,
did you go through like every single episode, or did you like pick out, so like in the original series? And of course, I think I've heard you talk about the Horta, for example, from Devil in the Dark. So did you say, okay, I'm going to do a talk on silicon-based life?
I did actually every single episode, because I was worried I was going to miss something. There were definitely ones I knew I was going to see. So, for example, like you said, the Horta with Devil in the Dark's the name of the episode. I knew that was going to be in there. I knew which chapter it was going to be in, but I still wanted to go through all, because there might be other things, and there were some things I'd forgotten. Some things like the crystalline entity from Next Generation, which again is another silicon-based life form. Or there was another one, the microbrain, also from Next Generation, was also a silicon-based. So I mean, there are so many other things, and I didn't want to just pick one and then not mention these others, and then the reviews of the book come out and say, well, hey, there's these other things and you didn't say anything about those. I wanted to be fairly comprehensive, both on the science in terms of that as well as on the sci-fi. And given that took a full year, I would have to do that again if I was to write a true sequel in the sense of new topics. Now, what I think is more likely would be, say, a second edition, where at that point, then I can just use all the Star Treks that have come out since then, incorporate those things. There are a couple of little tiny things I would probably write a little bit differently now. Maybe the science is advanced, or I just missed a little thing that I could have mentioned that didn't. There's tweaks I would do too. I think I would do that much sooner than I would actually write a true new sequel on new science, because I'd have to start at the very beginning again and go through all of it. And all of it gets bigger each time, right?
Exactly. It picking up on that point, and speaking of the science, and one of the things that as a fan I noticed with the show is many times they'll use a transporter as the cheat code to help solve some issue, whether it's a plot point or a plot hole, or I know you've talked quite a bit about Tom Paris and the Warp 10, so I don't want you to to talk about that one again. But I was thinking, like, for example, Unnatural Selection was one that popped out for me from season 2 of Next Generation with Dr. Pulaski, and she was, it was sort of they early on in that show they were recycling a lot of plot points from the original series, and this is one where she was, turned older. And then, of course, they use the transporter to reconstruct her. And then there's other examples, as well, as far as how the transport is used, splitting people apart and pulling them back together and creating clones and duplicates and all that kind of stuff. So what are your thoughts on where to get the science right and biology right, assuming that you could do a transporter, and how does that work on a DNA or biological level to do some of the things? And not sure why they bring you in to try to give a science explanation when they're drafting the script to fill in that blank.
Okay. Let's split those because those are long answers to each of those things. So first on the transporter, actually, I'm going to defer my answer to my colleague, Dr. Erin McDonald. She's the official science consultant for the Star Trek universe. So she's actually paid, regularly to help with all the current series, as opposed to my role, which is just contract. But she has said several times that transporters would never work because of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So basically, being able to put everything back together exactly the same way, that she's like, that would never actually work. Now, if you were to set that aside, I mean, they say they have these Heisenberg compensators, whatever that means. If that were to work, I mean, at that point, I mean, you could do anything. You could just create an army of clones. I mean, it's not at all clear why there's any barrier. It's not even clear that you're actually transporting anybody at that point, right? That, I don't understand why you couldn't just make multiple copies, as sometimes happens. You remember, of course, the splitting of the good and the bad Kirk as a kind of silly example there. But at that point, sure, could you make a younger self? Sure, you could just make a ton of selves. It's definitely a cheat code, I guess you'd say, in terms of that, solving those sorts of problems. And honestly, I don't understand why they don't use it all the time. So they say things about that. Oh, well, we can't hold people in the buffer for very long, and I'm not really sure aren't they just saved? What's the issue? But maybe there's something about the form of energy that they're being kept in. I'm not sure. That gets way more into the physics than the biology there. So I would punt that one to her. What was the second half? There was something about consulting that you just asked.
Yeah. So how does that work as far as you are a science consultant to Star Trek or any other show?
Sure.
How whenever they're developing the script and come across a plot point that they need explanation for to make it work or not work.
Yeah.
How does that whole process go?
Sure. There's a lot of possibilities. Sometimes it's, so again, like I said, Dr. Erin McDonald, she's actually the main science consultant. She's like actually on retainer from them to do this. Sometimes I literally just get a, one sentence text from her saying, is blah, blah, blah okay? And I can just text her back saying, yes, because of blah, 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 or no, because blah, 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 but you could make it, blah, blah instead. It could be something that quick. I mean, that's sort of the bare minimum. Sometimes it's more, here is a season-wide arc that's going to be happening. It involves, and I always use the same fictional example because I want to make sure I never get in trouble and accidentally relay something that hasn't actually aired yet. And actually, nothing I've consulted on has actually come out yet, so they're all still in process of coming out. But a fictional example, this is not one I've actually consulted on, it would be, what if there was a plot point where they wanted to make somebody turn invisible while people were watching them? So at that point, maybe would have a phone conversation with the showrunner to talk about exactly what are the parameters around this, how fast they have to turn invisible, is there any consequence you're looking for it? Does it have to be invisible in the sense of just looking straight at them, or can they be seen from different angles? So I'd ask a lot of questions, and then I would do some research on the side, and I would sometimes write like a one-page write-up. Here's a couple of ways that this could happen. Here's the advantages to this. Here's disadvantages, and here are things you'd have to make sure to work in. I might have some sample dialogue in there. In my case, I'm very anal, so I'll sometimes put literature citations to the scientific papers associated with these things. Partly it's honestly to cover my own self too later, because I want to make sure I'm being rigorous. But also, if somebody later complains and says, "Well, that's ridiculous. That would never happen," you can say, "Well, here's all the different pieces, and here are the scientific citations for each one." So that's the most rigorous version. And then there's anything in between. Sometimes it's just we need a little bit of background dialogue around X thing that's happening. What would somebody be saying around X happening who's a biologist or who's a physicist? And I'll just provide a little bit of dialogue around that, and some examples of how that would work and what that would mean. But there's a pretty wide spectrum there. It's very it's very much tailored to what they're looking for. Now the tricky thing is, as will often happen, story trumps science. They'll sometimes ask for something like, for example, just making something go invisible, and they say you can see it, you can be looking from any direction, and they're human, and they haven't changed their mass, and all this stuff. And it's like, okay, that would never happen. So what I would try to do there is I would try to get them as close as possible. Say, okay, I'm going to take away, let's say there's 6 hurdles. I'm going to take away 4 of them. 2 of them are still there, and we'll just do a makeup thing for the last 2. Because again, people aren't watching Star Trek because they think it's National Geographic or they think it's an accurate depiction of what's happening in the world. They're watching because they want good entertainment. And what the writers want is they want it to not be crazy. They want it to be something where this is at least close to reality. And I applaud them for that. And you see the contrast to this, of course, is very often in sort of comic sort of shows that sometimes they just don't even care. They just toss out this random word. It's like, yeah, okay, whatever.
You know that you pretty much just told Will that Santa isn't real, right? Just his poor heart. His poor heart
broken.
Can't take it.
It's broken. I can't take it anymore. I can't.
But I do, on that note, I do want to ask you about your own suspension of disbelief. Not only now that you see a little bit more behind the scenes, but before you got involved into the consulting and also seeing a bit of the movie magic. Were you watching Star Trek or other sci-fi shows and being critical of them, or did you always go into those knowing that the story will trump the science?
I always figure the story to trump the science. Otherwise, I would never be able to watch The Flash, for example. That's one of the most out there. Of course, it's also tongue in cheek there when they do that sometimes too. But no, I mean, I'll sometimes laugh about it. Or like,
it doesn't work for me though. So.
I'll sometimes laugh about things like, oh, come on, really? Like you couldn't have just. The only times I find it frustrating is if it's something that would have been really easy to fix. Like if they use a term but they use the wrong term. Like, okay, really? Like this would have been really easy to just make it fine. Now, if it's moving so fast you go back in time, like, okay, well, whatever.
Right. So speaking of the Arrowverse, I know you. So are you? What other? I know you noted that whenever we first started, you were a big Star Trek fan, and then
Yep.
When you were at conventions, people were asking about The Expanse and other programs. What other things are you into right now as far as current TV? Given that there's a whole host of options out there, from broadcast to streaming to cable.
Oh yeah. So I've been watching. Actually, I have been watching now The Expanse. I'd put it off. I think I'd watched the first couple of episodes before. And the first couple episodes are a little bit slow moving, and I just kind of dropped it and I didn't pick it up again. But multiple people told me, no, really, you'd like this episode. Just power through the first few episodes, and I think you'll get into it. And now I'm in season 3, and I'm completely hooked. I think it's fantastic. So I'm really enjoying that. I am watching, of course, the new Star Trek series as they're coming out. So I've been really enjoying Star Trek Lower Decks right now. And earlier this year when Picard was out, and then I'm very much looking forward to Discovery coming in a couple of weeks. I do watch The Flash, so I think I'm actually completely caught up on it too. And I watched Arrow through where it ended in terms of the Arrowverse. I haven't watched Stargirl, even though I saw your podcast about that. But I'm curious to check it out, but I haven't actually seen it yet. I watched Legends of Tomorrow, but it got a little too tongue in cheek for me after a point.
Oh yeah, they are not afraid of jumping the shark on that show. That's for sure.
Not at all.
But I admire the fact that they just laugh about it too, though. Like they're not pretending to be serious. They're just okay. Yeah, they're clearly just being silly, and it's fine.
It's very similar to Supernatural. How there's the first 5 seasons serious, and then as this show continued on, the more goofy episodes and just bottleneck episodes kind of about.
Yeah.
I haven't actually watched that, but I've heard that too.
Yeah.
So speaking of shows and stuff, and so of course I'm the admitted Star Trek fan here on the SNN Nerd podcast, but as folks know who've listened to us, Sarah did indulge me earlier this year to watch Star Trek Picard, and we did pods on it together. So as far as Trekkie the Trekkie, and we have a on the fence person with us right now. What would be your elevator pitch, especially to our listeners who many of them may also be on the fence about Star Trek, or they're hardcore Star Wars, or what would be your elevator pitch to say what are they missing about Star Trek that why they should come on board and go through this universe that's been around for over 50 years?
That's a great question. I'd say three things, I think. So first of all, there's a very hopeful vision for the future there, right? That most of humanity has come together. They've put their past prejudices mostly aside, and they're now working towards this sort of common goal or common sets of goals. The big problems in the world, like world hunger, all seem to be solved, and now it's largely a happy place, even though there's challenges that come up, but the challenges are not so much internal, they're more external. So that's one. Two, what I really like is that science is valued. And now when I say that, I mean that in two directions here. Both it's valued by the characters in the show, in the sense that everybody there values science. Everybody wants to know what's the scientific reason for this. Nobody doubts the science. They're very positive about science in general. But also, the show writers try to explain things using science as much as possible. Now, of course, I'm biased now since I'm actually contributing a little bit to this, but long before any involvement by me, they were always trying to explain things they saw using science. And actually, you could see that there were science consultants. Andre Bormanis did this for many, many different of the older series, and did a really, really stellar job trying to get the science right in there. And that's admirable to see that. But the third thing is, honestly, it's just great stories in a diversity of formats. If you like episodic shows, or if you like arc-based shows, you can say, oh, I want Next Generation, or I want Discovery. If you want serious, or if you want funny, you can say, well, serious, will that be again Discovery? Or funny, you can say Lower Decks. If you want heavily focused on social issues, you can say, I'm going to watch Next Generation. If you really want political intrigue, then maybe Deep Space Nine is more your thing. So I'd say those three things, the positive aspect, the value of science, and great stories with a diversity of formats.
Well, that's like a big question for me, because you know about why I have like a Star Trek block, and it's mainly because that was my older brother's thing.
Yeah, I
associate him with it.
I know.
It's all but so I know about Star Trek. I've seen things, but I've never been a diehard Trekkie or anything.
Yeah.
I do have a question. Is there a real battle between Star Wars fans and Star Trek fans? Is that a real?
No, not in the least. I think the vast majority of people like both. I think people love to tease about it, but there's no fight there at all. Now, I will say I've given talks. This is actually coming back to Professor Spana from Duke, I mentioned earlier. He and I, and then now more recently, we've included also Stephen Grenade and Dr. Aaron McDonald also, where we've done these Star Wars versus Star Trek science tag team fight talks, where we talk about good science in our franchise, and then we mock something from the other franchise.
Right.
But it's very much in good spirits. Like, I love Star Wars. I've seen every new Star Wars movie right after it's come out, and I've been really excited about it too. I mean, and the same with all of them. Like, so Eric Spana, who I mentioned, he's more on the Star Wars side, but he's watched all the Star Trek series. He's watched the Star Trek movies. He's all over it as well. So it's more just for fun. I don't think there's anything like that. Now, there are some people who really do just like one or the other. They say, oh, Star Trek is too cerebral, or oh, Star Wars is too just fantasy. Yeah, there's a few people like that, but I think the vast majority of people really like both.
Right. Yeah. I think once you're hooked on the genre itself, then it opens. I mean, it's an expanse of opportunities, because, jeez, that show.
I see what you did there.
I tried.
I didn't even grab it until you said it. That's awesome.
So, speaking of science, and while we have you for the last few moments, so
sure.
with the genre, and not so we don't get into this pitting one thing after another, but what are some things in the genre that you see from a scientist standpoint that, and you've touched on this some, but I'd like for you to expand on a little bit more.
Sure. Things
that drive you crazy, things that you're like, yeah, they got this right, and how, if they called you up and said, hey, how could I fix this? How would you, what would be your
Great
suggestions?
Great question. So so something they tend to get right is often the very basic genetics. Now, of course, I'm paying most attention here to biology. I'll make a couple of quick comments about physics, but that's not really my area. But in the biology area, they tend to get basic genetics right. Like when they say something is dominant, they usually have the right term. If they say it's recessive, they have the right term. In terms of inheritance, they tend to have that pretty good in general. So those are things that most sci-fi tend to get pretty good. Evolution, the idea of common ancestry, in the sense that all like living species on Earth are closely related. Star Trek has fully embraced that from the very beginning. A lot of other science fiction has fully embraced it. Now, whether we're related to aliens or not, that's a whole separate question. But honestly, it's an unanswered question. I mean, since we haven't encountered aliens, we don't know the answer to that. So I feel like those pieces are okay. Some of the things that I think get done problematically or could be better, as you were saying, oh man, the word mutation. You know, and I'm not just talking about the X-Men version here, but like when people say, oh, you know, he got this mutation and all of a sudden, like, you know, 2 days later, he looks like an octopus or something like that. Like, what the heck?
So you're saying Spider-Man can't happen?
No.
The lizard, yeah.
Well, mostly just, there's a lot of things that happen there in the sense that when you have a mutation, generally speaking, a mutation is not directed. It's going to be like a random change somewhere in your DNA sequence in some random cell. So like that one cell has it. Well, first of all, mutations are way more likely to be bad than good. It's much less likely that a random change in your DNA sequence will suddenly make something better than it was before. It's much more likely to make it worse. Just the analogy I like to use in my classes, it's like throwing a hammer at a car. You know, there's a very low probability you'll actually make it better. But a high probability you'll make it worse, just because, again, it's been tuned over 4 billion years of evolution. So that's one thing. But then the spread of it, like when it happens in one cell, it's not going to happen the same mutation is not going to happen in all your cells. And cells don't divide very fast. Like if you have really rapid cell division in just a subset of your cells, yeah, that's that thing we call cancer. That's not good. It's not going to turn you into a spider. It's just bad. So that's problematic. Now there are workarounds. And rather than having it be a mutation per se, you could have something that involves some sort of genetic engineering. So, for example, let's say it's a virus that like a retrovirus, which will actually basically insert its part of its code into your cells. It might then spread across multiple cells and could then get to your whole body. So that solves one problem. The other thing is the speed with which these changes happen. Often in sci-fi, when somebody gets a mutation, like within days, they're completely different. Cells don't divide that fast. So if the cells aren't dividing, you're not going to look any different. You're not going to have new abilities. You're going to have to wait until all of those cells have divided and basically been replaced. So I mean, it might take like weeks or months or something like that, right. Depending on which part of your body. Some cells divide much faster than others. So that's something which I feel like it could be closer to reality, but again, if we want a story, like we don't want Spider-Man to have to happen over the course of like months. We probably want him to be Spider-Man pretty quick. So some problems can be fixed by doing the retrovirus, but some problems probably can't easily be fixed. In terms of the physics, I mean, every place seems to have sound in space, which is clearly problematic. You hear the whoosh of all these shows, of all these ships in space. Clearly, that's not going to happen. There's gravity issues, there's inertia issues, things like that. Like, what is artificial gravity? Now, artificial gravity is actually sometimes talked about pretty well. It's like the way some shows show it, where it's basically associated with acceleration. So essentially, if a ship spends half its time accelerating and then flips and spends half its time decelerating, then yeah, you actually could potentially get something just like gravity in that sense, because basically it is inertia that's happening there. But if you have something going at light speed and then suddenly stopping, yeah, everything inside there would be smeared against the wall. So, but again, Star Trek at least addresses it. I mean, it doesn't solve it, but it addresses it by saying, well, we have inertial dampeners. Now, apparently inertial dampeners never seem to work when it's like a torpedo hits and everything shakes, because you would think that would also...
They temporarily go offline.
Yeah, they're kind of like, they're dodgy inertial dampeners, but somehow they're really good at going from warp to impulse drive or whatever. But yeah, those are some examples of things that I think are done pretty well, and or not so well. Mutation is definitely one of the worst. Well, I guess the other thing too is alien interbreeding. Oh my gosh. There's so much alien interbreeding. And now there is one way you could make that work. The way you could make alien interbreeding work is if the relationship of aliens to us is about the same as, say, humans to Neanderthal. Like, so if the aliens came from Earth 100,000 years ago or a couple 100,000 years ago, and they went to this other place, and maybe they then got pointy ears or ruffled foreheads or a little ridges right at the top of their nose. Yeah, that's okay, because we know humans and Neanderthals did interbreed here on Earth in the last 100,000 years. And, they probably didn't look exactly the same. So yeah, that aspect would be good. But if either we're completely unrelated, or if we're related but like way, way back, say millions or worse, billions of years ago, there's no way we'd make hybrids. I mean, we're literally more closely related to grass than we are to something which has a common ancestor 4 billion years ago.
Wow.
So there is a workaround again. And actually, so Star Trek, in the original series, there was one episode where they showed up at this planet, they beamed down, and there are these Native Americans there. And they said, the super race called the Preservers had actually taken populations from various planets and plopped them down on other worlds. Now, of course, they'd have to plop them down with everything they need to survive. So they need to put, bring like plants and fish and everything else that they're going to consume, and they'll provide air for them. But if they did that, sure, that would work.
Speaking of genetic engineering that you mentioned earlier, so sure. That's another trope that we see a lot of times in science fiction, of genetic engineering to engineer better humans.
Yep.
But of course, in the Star Trek universe, obviously it's the augments and Consing.
Yep.
And then another, and we've seen in other movies and shows in the genre as well. So again, could we engineer a Consing to be better at physically better, mentally better, like we've seen in these shows, or is that again one of those things where story is driving more so than the science?
Well, the tricky thing with Khan specifically is it's actually a funny story on Khan. If you go back to the original episode he was in, which is called Space Seed in the original series, it never actually said he was genetically engineered. It actually said he was a product of selective breeding, which is interesting because that would basically essentially what that would mean is you raise a bunch of kids, and take the strongest one, have the strongest couple, have them breed, and then raise. Right, it's just like what we do with corn or something like that, right?
Right.
Is that possible? I mean, it's socially repulsive, of course, in many respects, but there's no scientific barrier to actually executing it. Now, the tricky thing would be like the timing of that. Khan was supposedly around in the 1990s. So given the show aired in the 1960s, you would have had one generation of natural selection.
Yeah.
So probably you couldn't have made Khan that fast. Now, if it was actually true genetic engineering, again, setting aside, of course, the high immorality of doing such things, could you edit in some way to make somebody stronger or things like that? I think right now it would be challenging. One of the biggest barriers is things like intelligence or physical strength or things like that. It's not like there's just one gene. It's not like you can just tweak this one gene, change these couple of letters from T's to A's, and all of a sudden like they're a lot smarter. It tends to be very, very, very complicated, and often a lot of it's not even genetic. A lot of it is how the person was raised, the cultural that they were raised in, things like that affect how they score on tests, or how much they worked out in terms of how strong they are and what their diet was like, things like that. So it would be hard. But could you make some difference? In principle, it would be possible. I don't think we're at the stage where we could do that. But in principle, I could imagine, say, many hundreds of years from now, there would be a couple of tweaks that you could do to make somebody a little bit stronger, or a little bit quote unquote smarter. Smarter is always a very touchy question, even what that means.
Right. So maybe not necessarily Khan, but maybe more like Julian Bashir.
Yeah, the more likely thing that I think that could be done would be fixing problems more so than making like something sort of super. So let's say, for example, somebody had a disease that would result in them having extraordinarily weak, being extraordinarily physically weak, or had some sort of mental issue, and there's a specific mutation associated with that. It's possible. I think that would be much more likely that you could go in and repair that mutation, so that then they're more in the sort of the normal spectrum of how people tend to be who don't have the disease. I think that is much more feasible, and it's also less ethically objectionable too.
Good deal. Well,
there's a slippery slope there, because people can start saying, well, does somebody have a disadvantage because they don't have blonde hair? Does somebody have a disadvantage? Yeah. So it is definitely a strong, slippery slope. Right. So it would have to be. We'd have to tread very carefully.
We would have to tread carefully, and that's one of the things we've talked about, how the genre from whereas Star Trek Arrowverse shows like Watchmen and others are really good at really addressing some of these ethical issues, and actually that's my last question for you before we wrap up is, as far as ethical issues, as far as a science advisor, do you also, whenever you and your colleagues get questions from the creative team, address any of the ethical issues whenever you're providing the technical response to their questions?
That's a great question. So, I mean, I have to say, I haven't done that many of these consults so far, and I don't feel like that's really especially come up. I will say that I feel like, at least with the Star Trek writers, they're very, very, very attuned to ethical issues. Like, they're very much on top of it. Where, like, you know, I can remember instances where I've suggested something, well, could we do blah, blah, blah? And the response has been no, because we don't want a perception that, you know, and then, like, say, taking the same idea that I tossed out, you know, 100-fold bigger, but that might have a negative societal implication. Like, oh, that's not what I was suggesting at all. But they're very, very, very forward thinking in that context. So I don't know that they would actually need me to do that. I think they would already be very much on top of it. They're very, very thoughtful in that arena.
Great.
Wow.
Great.
Wow. I do have another question.
Please. For you. I have one for you guys too.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Well, I just want to ask about the YouTube channel.
Oh, sure.
And how that started, what you've learned so far, and also just the idea about why suddenly putting out content on YouTube.
That's a great question. So it was a combination of two things. Number one was just seeing the level of excitement on the cruise was really inspirational, right? That people were so excited to, like, ask lots of questions about the science. I actually, when we were on the cruise, I started having what I called office hours. So I did this at breakfast. Now think about this. On the cruise, people were staying up really late to party, as you can imagine. I was having office hours at 8:30 in the morning in the buffet restaurant, saying, if anyone wants to come and just chat science with me, if you want to do that. I would show up 30 minutes early and there would be a line waiting.
Wow.
That's the level of enthusiasm and excitement for science there. I was like, okay, I guess I'm not going to eat first. I'll just dive right in. But it was wonderful. It was so intellectually stimulating and such really thoughtful questions and just excitement around it. I loved it. So having done that, I reached out to some of the CBS folks, and I was curious about doing something along these lines, where maybe making a couple of educational videos and seeing if maybe I could put them on StarTrek.com or something like that. And they were interested, but the problem was, of course, this was now at the start of the pandemic. They said for any content that's going to be there, we really want filming to be on site and by their camera department. They didn't want sort of the homemade kind of thing I would be making. Given the pandemic, I'm obviously not flying to New York or LA or any of these places to do that sort of thing. So I said, all right, let me just go ahead and do this myself. And given the pandemic, you know, I was staying home anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It was fun. I mean, I just so I did. At the very beginning, I made four short things, and I just basically released them one per week for that time. And they were basically snippets from talks I was giving, but
Right.
the response was really positive. Like people were retweeting it a lot. Like they each have several hundred views. So having seen that, I said, you know what, I'm happy to keep doing this, but, you know, kind of sporadically, not all the time, because obviously I don't get paid for doing this. I get no money from it. It's not monetized in any way, shape, or form. So it's just purely volunteer labor of love, as you like to say. But
Yeah.
I really enjoy doing it.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, I'm sure it
Sounds very
does.
familiar.
I'm
Yeah.
sure it does.
Yeah. So what was your question for us?
Yeah, I was curious what you all thought of the reboot Star Trek movies.
Oh,
Mm.
those movies. Huh. Will.
Okay, I'll follow the sword first.
I'll get my answers here.
So I Star Trek 2009, I think it was when it came out. I really enjoyed the Kelvin universe.
Yeah.
I thought they did a very clever way of splitting the timeline.
Yep.
And giving us, you know, it sort of combined a lot of little rumors and elements and things that we've heard in the fandom on chat rooms and bulletin boards and other things, as far as, you know, an Academia-based show, which they did have that, and then we also see how this version of Jim Kirk became captain of the Enterprise.
Yeah.
I think Star Trek Into Darkness, I actually liked it.
Yeah.
I wish they had not been so coy about saying that Benedict Cumberbatch was just John Harrison, was not Khan. It was so obvious that it was Khan, even though they kept insisting that it wasn't. And for the longest time, I tried to defend it, but the more and more I thought about it, I just can't anymore. So,
Yeah.
Honestly, for that one, I just wish they just didn't. I mean, I wish they just made him somebody else. Like, why? I mean, Wrath of Khan was already epic. Why try to redo it? Just do your own movie.
Do your own movie.
JJ.
Yeah. Do your own movie. Don't flip. Just don't mirror everything that happened in Wrath of Khan and do it and not do it, execute it as well, and almost become a parody of it. Yeah. Star Trek Beyond, I thought was a nice recover from the franchise. My main quibble with it was the whole trope about destroying the Enterprise.
Yeah,
it's just become one of these things that is just, we're gonna have to, okay, it's a movie, we got to destroy the Enterprise. Search for Spock, whenever the first time it was done, it was really plot driven. It was really, it was built into the larger theme of the series. But from Generations to the Crash and Nemesis to to what we saw in Beyond. Come on, y'all, get original. Don't need to have an NC-1701A just for the sake of having one.
Yeah,
right.
That's my rant for Star Trek.
I'm with you on all those things too. I mean, I loved the first reboot movie. I thought it was excellent, and it was a creative new story. It was an interesting twist. It had a slight tie-in there with having Leonard Nimoy in there too. I thought that was stellar. Number two, like I said, I just wish they'd just done their own thing. It's like, don't make this Khan. And really, does this person look like a Khan Noonien Singh, like this little English guy? And the third, I enjoyed the third quite a bit.
Yeah, I think that I've seen all of the movies. I don't remember them really, and you guys both have already touched on Khan and the failings there. But for me, I remember seeing Khan when I was really little, being totally scared of it. That movie scared me. Then again, The Wizard of Oz scared me too. The Witch, fair for a young kid. So going in that movie, I thought, oh, they're gonna redo it and it's gonna be stellar, and it just fell flat. And I think overall, the entire trilogy, I would argue, did not do a good job at telling a solid story to really bring in everybody into this new universe. And it almost went kind of the comic book route, where I think, especially with the Khan sequel, where they were retelling stories that we already know about, but new actors, and thinking that, it'll be just as relevant as it was, and it's that we have that happen with the Spider-Man movie universe all the time. So I think that these writers just need to tell new stories. Now, that being said, they are making their mark in the TV with all of the new series. I know Discovery, a lot of people love it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people love Picard, as well as Below Decks. What is it?
Yeah, Lower Decks just getting started. I'm 50-50 right now. Yeah, Lower Decks.
I really like it a lot. I really think it's hilarious.
Yeah.
This is the first time I've heard about this show, and Will has apparently been watching it for weeks, and so I'm.
So I should tell you something, Sarah.
I know, it says a lot. All right. Well, thank you so much for being a part of our show and coming and talking to us, but mainly to Will about Star Trek. And not ruining anything for him, but basically ruining it and reminding him it's not real. But no, we really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. It's really an honor to speak with you guys. Thank you for having me on the show.
You want to tell our listeners where they can find you?
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Mohamed Noor. It's M like Michael, A like Apple, F like Frank, Noor, N like November, OOR. Or if you go to YouTube and just search for BioTrekkie-explains, it'll come right up. BioTrekkie has 2 Ks, by the way, and ends with an IE.
And Will, where can they find you?
Yes, you can always find me on Twitter at Will M. Polk, WILLMPOLK.
And you can find me on Twitter at sjbelmont, SJBELMONT. Please follow our crew on Twitter at CNN Nerd. Friend us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, but most importantly, rate, subscribe, and comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Good night, Geek Out. You're welcome.